This time, we're going to talk about Busan. Greetings and salutations, my most excellent friends. Welcome once more to the Chi Ranger Adventures podcast. And if you're joining us live on YouTube Sunday morning, 5 a.m. Korea Standard Time, welcome. This is the Chi Ranger Adventures podcast. It comes out every single Sunday morning, and I am jazzed to have you here with me. This is episode number 10 of season number 2. Welcome. And if you're joining me on the podcast, on the download, thank you so much for taking the time out to download the podcast via iTunes or on the actual blog site itself, whether you're listening to it live on the blog or if you downloaded the MP3. But this week and from this week forward, this first section of the podcast is going to be simulcast here on the podcast and live on YouTube. Well, I say live, but really on YouTube. We're going to record the first segment of the podcast and then put it up on YouTube at the same time the podcast goes live. And I'm really jazzed about that because I want to get some feedback as to what you think about this process and also what you think about the podcast, because when we return for season number 3, I think I might do the entire podcast in this format. So let me know what you think. The reason why I have decided to include this first segment as a video is because if you're just watching the video and maybe you've never listened to the podcast before, the podcast has several different segments. Now, in this opening segment, I talk about some news, I talk about some events that I participate in, and it's a lot of information that I usually don't share elsewhere, either on my blog site or on YouTube. So I wanted to have a way to share that with you on the YouTube audience side of things, just in case you don't listen to it. The second segment is what we call the Content Rewind. Now, the Content Rewind is where I go over a lot of the behind-the-scenes stories of the videos that I put up on YouTube, but also include a lot of information about articles I write and events I participate in away from YouTube. So if you don't follow the blog or you don't follow some of the other writings that I do, it's a way for you to see what else I do in this communication medium that I participate in, both writing for magazines here in Korea, on the radio, and so forth. The third section of the podcast is what I like to call, well, it's a lot of fun. It's the question of the week, And those are submitted by folks either on Facebook or on Twitter or through email. And I sit down and I respond to those. And anyone can ask me a question anytime. Sometimes I save them up for a podcast. Sometimes I make an instantaneous video response on the vlog channel. But either way, that's what that section of the podcast is for. The fourth segment of the podcast is also a lot of fun, and that's the travel talk segment of the podcast. As you know, I love to travel. So on that segment of the podcast, what I do is I alternate between my radio appearances on TBS EFM, where the segment is called Hit the Road with An Jung-hung, and we talk about various destinations in Korea, but also around the world. And on weeks that we don't rebroadcast that segment, it's actually a lot of fun as well because I sit down and interview someone in the travel industry or someone who has had an interesting travel experience. And it's about maybe a 10-minute interview, maybe a 15-minute interview. And it's a lot of fun. The entire podcast ranges between 30 and 40 minutes, so it's a good fair amount of time. But it's an offline thing you can do, so you can hit pause and resume it later. And as I said, it's available via iTunes on the website as a play on demand, or you can download the MP3 to listen to later. But that's one item of news this week. The second item of news this week, and it's something I'm very happy about. It's not a subject I like talking about, but it is something I am very happy about. Now, back in 2010, there was an English teacher in Daegu, and it came out that it looked like he molested students. But before he was brought to justice, he fled the country and went back to the United States. Now, it was just announced earlier this week that the United States extradited him to Korea, and he's on his way back to face these charges. And I think that is brilliant, because there is absolutely no reason whatsoever that someone should get away with touching a kid. That is sick, that is wrong, and you deserve to be put away. However, as grateful as I am that the wheels of justice seem to be working in this case, it's also causing a lot of problems. Now, I say a lot of problems because, unfortunately, journalism here in Korea is not exactly what I would call open and impartial. I like to think of it as a very colorful flavor of yellow journalism. And when we deal with native English-speaking teachers, it really comes out, because you have one incident and it's instantaneously generalized across all persons of that race or that category. And here are some examples. If an American serviceman, acts inappropriately in Itaewon, it instantaneously becomes generalized as all American servicemen behave this way in Itaewon. When it surrounds English teachers, it instantaneously becomes all English teachers are molesters. All English teachers are drug addicts. All English teachers, all they care about is getting drunk in Korea. And it causes a lot of problems. Now, for a number of years, the reporting was always hit and miss. You'd have an issue of drugs come up with native English speakers. And, drugs are legal in Korea, and that's the law, and you need to obey the law. But the way it was reported in the media was that, person X is an English teacher, he does drugs, so all English teachers need to go get drug testing, blah, 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 blah. But when you dug deeper into the issue, you found out that, it was actually a Kyopo, an ethnically Korean person here teaching English, maybe a Korean American, Korean Canadian. And that's where some of the problems created. You see, up until recently, an ethnically Korean person could come into Korea on an F4 visa, bypass all the checks and balances that an E2 visa, like myself, has to go through to teach English. So, Joe Blow from America, who's ethnically Korean, could come over here without a background check, without verifying a degree, and teach English. Whereas, Susie Q, American, would have to verify that, she had a valid degree, go through a police background check, which is now an FBI check, and, go through a medical test to teach the same kids. And then Susie Q was bound by her visa to work at that one school for an entire year, whereas, Joe Blow, Korean American, could, essentially switch jobs anytime they wanted. It was very unfair. Now, individuals wanting to teach students on an F4 visa have to follow the same rules and regulations that an E2 person does. And I'm very thankful for that. Another case that this kind of played out in was last fall. Maybe you've seen the video. I know Victor, Give Me a Flick Man, posted some videos with it. I did a video response on it as well, about a black North American man verbally abusing an elderly couple in Seoul on a bus. And, that caused a lot of uproar. And, it painted a very negative picture of not only Americans, but black Americans and black people in general in Korea. And part of the reason is, Korea is a very homogeneous society. I've mentioned it very many times that the way I look at race relations here in Korea, and while I haven't really experienced any racism, the way I view race relations here in Korea is that because 1% of the population is foreign, by and large, people don't have a lot of experience meeting and interacting with foreigners. So if your only experience with a black person is this video on YouTube of him acting belligerent towards elderly Korean, you know, I understand that that may now be your first and lasting impression of Americans, of English teachers, of black people. It's not to say that some people act that way, because I've certainly run into them both here in Korea, but way more in the United States. So, you know, we're under a microscope because we stick out so much. So, you know, the unbalanced reporting doesn't help. You know, the exposure that people get on the internet doesn't help. But, you know, in light of this particular issue of the guy coming back to face these charges, I really hope that open and fair journalism plays out in this issue as it goes through the court system. Who knows what's ultimately going to happen? Who knows if he'll be found guilty? All I'm glad to know is that someone who fled the country because he knew he was going to be indicted on charges is coming back to face the music. So with that, I'm going to end this first segment of the podcast. Thank you very much for watching on YouTube. If you want to continue with the other segments of the podcast, the link to the blog article will be down in the description box. And for you listening, let's get on to the next segment.